Hello and welcome to CRU's weekly ferroalloy roundup. I'm Alex Anderson, and today I'm joined by Greg Smart and Claire Hanna to take a look at the recent activity on the manganese ore and manganese alloy markets. Claire, I guess if you just want to kick us off and tell us what's been going on in the Chinese ore market.
Well, as you can see from the graph in front of you, there's been a spectacular increase in the port prices for manganese ore over the last week, and it stems from the shutdown that was announced in South Africa last week, which has had a big impact on the manganese ore industry. A number of companies declared force majeure, and others have switched to care and maintenance operations. So the Chinese market has obviously been very concerned by that, and while there was a sort of initial delay in reaction, prices really moved very, very quickly at the very back end of last week and this week, as people became concerned about the sort of future supply availability. And the position in China, in South Africa, is quite confused really as well, because the government have allowed the essential activities to continue, and then the definition of essential has been a slightly moving feast, I think. So we've seen, for example, some iron ore mines able to continue operating, and Transnet and the ports have supported that sort of activity. But that hasn't happened in manganese, although there have been some announcements that were released earlier that sort of implied that might be true, weren't there, Greg? I think you'd seen something on that.
I think, well, the situation's definitely been confused this week, because the announcement last week said that they'd lock down everything apart from what you've mentioned, the essential goods, and then we've heard this week that one of the authorities was that there'd been a reversal of the decision, and people thought that manganese ore would then be allowed to be exported again, and then we've since heard today that that was not accurate and that there is still a lockdown. So there's been a lot of to and froing, and no one was really sure. I mean, even some of the mining companies themselves were confused by the number of different things they were hearing from the authorities and even from their customers. So yeah, it's been a confusing week. So we've seen prices react to that as well. That confusion and uncertainty.
So prices spiked, and that little bit that you can see where it dropped off was, I think, perhaps linked to that letter and announcement that we saw, where things looked like they might be easing up a bit for manganese. So we can see it's a really very sort of febrile and volatile atmosphere with people reacting to any sort of news they're hearing. And of course that impact has spread beyond China. Prior to the announcement about South Africa, there was an announcement of the lockdown in Malaysia, where the some ore comes to China from as well, and I think that's caused the Chinese to look at their raw material supply chains and consider what else might be at risk beyond South Africa as well. And they're also concerned from their own experience that the 21 days it is not actually going to be 21 days. They believe there are significant concerns it will be longer than that as well. So that's probably built up into that price spike as well.
Yeah, and as you say, it's interesting that spike in the prices has been so much, like 40% move, almost in a couple of days, when there are still, as we understand, a lot of inventories sitting at the ports there anyway that can be consumed and purchased.
Yeah, Chinese stocks are been at record levels. We saw a lot of material arriving at the back end of last year. Material continued to arrive in January in the run up to Chinese New Year, and obviously with the slowdown that came as a result of the coronavirus and the shutdown in China, there was a lot less demand, and stocks continued to rise. And what also became apparent, which wasn't being recorded before, was that there's the best part of 1 million tons of ore in bonded warehouses in Kaofudien. So when you looked at the overall numbers, there was something like 5.7 million tons of stock at one point in China, which was an all-time record. And while it's come down very slightly, it's still around 5 million, 5.5 million, and that's really just under 3 months stock. So there's not, short term, there's not a supply issue. So the price spike really is around concern about future supply.
Sure.
And I guess the context for that as well is, as everybody's looking globally at what's happening, we can see what's happened in India as well, and there's a lockdown in India, and we're also under lockdown of sorts in Europe and parts of the States as well. So I think that's all feeding into the atmosphere of uncertainty as well.
Yeah, and although we've seen this spike in port prices, in actual transactions, we have also heard offers in the seaborne market rising despite the fact that no one can really move anything at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's material from Gabon and Brazil that people can move into China.
Yeah.
I think there's an issue with Indian ports, from what we understand, where material either on its way or almost sat outside the ports can't be unloaded, so that there's some issues there that are causing some concern for some people.
Okay, sure.
But yeah, and nobody, I don't think there's any offers from South Africa at the moment until people have a clearer view of what's going on.
Okay.
So I guess, Claire, taking a look at the manganese alloy market in China, what have we seen there over the last, I guess, couple of weeks?
Well, we've seen the same spike in prices in reaction to the Chinese lockdown, but I think what we've also seen as we look over the last couple of months is Chinese prices for manganese alloys also spiked as Chinese steel mills came back after the lockdown and issued their tenders, and that spike in the sort of mid-February is from one of the big tenders where there were still significant issues about moving material around, even producing material, getting ore from the ports. So there was really quite a big, the steel plants paid quite a big premium during that sort of time. But demand generally hasn't been that strong because obviously the recovery from the lockdown has been a sort of gradual process. And some markets, particularly construction, are still very weak. So prices sort of fell during September, and actually in March, the main steel mill tender, when it came out, shocked the market a bit because demand was, or the requirement was 25% down on the February requirement, and prices settled again quite a bit lower than the market was expecting. The silicon manganese price dipped below 6,000. So prices have been quite low and relatively subdued until people saw the lockdown in South Africa, and again we've seen the spike up on the back of that.
Sure. Greg, I don't know if you want to give us an overview of what's been happening in Europe as well.
Yeah, sure. So in the European market, we've seen a sort of similar situation emerge as what we've seen in China on the back of the spike in manganese ore prices. In Europe, we know that the market has been quite tight on silicomanganese and high carbon ferromanganese as well. But what's happened in the past couple of days is that the producers have been holding back material a little bit and offering just to a few selected customers. And some customers, steel mills in Central Europe, have been quite panicked by the events in South Africa and India as well. Obviously, a big exporter of manganese alloys, and so they've sort of panicked a little bit and looked to purchase some material, despite the fact that demand is down. as a result of the outbreak of the virus across Europe. So it's been quite a surprise. It's not a move that we necessarily expected to see. We saw prices already coming up in January and February as people were restocking, and a lot of buyers came into the spot market at once. But you'll notice that the prices really flattened out in March as we saw the sort of spread of the disease and Italy lockdown, and then sort of further lockdowns throughout Europe. So this spike at the end of March, beginning of April, in response to what's happened in the rest of the sort of international market, has been quite a surprise. But speaking to some of the producers, they said because of the spike in oil prices, if they need to buy more ore, they're going to be paying a lot more at these current levels, and especially if the lockdown in South Africa goes on. So there will be a real sort of squeeze on their margins. So they really need to lift alloy prices in order to continue making a profit.
And I guess some of the alloy producers also buy from South Africa as well to make up at least part of the blend of the ores they use. So some of them will have a half an eye on future supply as well. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and speaking to some of them as well, a lot of the alloy producers as well, they're tight of material because they're seeing a shift in demand from the Middle East as well. They're seeing more demand coming from the Middle East, where India used to sort of be an exporter before they were on a lockdown, a sort of fairly big exporter to that region. So we're sort of seeing a bit of a sort of squeeze on supply for the producers in Europe at the moment.
Thanks, Greg. Well, I think that gives a pretty good overview of what's been going on recently. So thank you very much, Greg and Claire, for the market insight. For more information on what's happening in the ferroalloy space, please be sure to read the full CRU Ferroalloys Weekly Review that's delivered to your inbox.